I'm really pleased to introduce Alex Chee, who will be interviewing RO. If you've been to an event before, or if you've been in our space a few times, it's likely you've seen Alex. He's a mainstay of our events here, and we're really proud to have him in our community. He's the author of the novels Edinburgh, The Queen of the Night, and the essay collection How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, which is available in the back. He's a contributing editor at The New Republic and an editor-at-large at BQR. His essays and stories have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, T Magazine, Tin House, Slate, Guernica, and Out, among others. He's the winner of a Whiting Award, an NEA Fellowship, and a 2010 MCCA Fellowship and a residency from the McDowell Colony, the VCCA, Civitella Ranieri, and Amtrak. He is an associate professor of English and creative writing at Dartmouth College. I'd also like to introduce R.O. Kwon. R.O. Kwon's debut novel, The Incendiaries, is a powerful, darkly glittering novel about violence, love, faith, and loss. As a young Korean-American woman at an elite American university is drawn into acts of domestic terrorism by cults tied to North Korea. Viet Thanh Nguyen writes, "To read her novel is to follow an inexorable flame coming closer and closer to the object it will detonate. The characters, the crime, the story, and ultimately the reader." Watch out. R.O. is a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellow, and her writing is published or forthcoming in The Guardian, Vice, BuzzFeed, Time, Noon, Electric Literature, Playboy, and elsewhere. She's received awards from Yaddo, McDowell, the Breadloaf Writers Conference, the C1E Writers Conference, Omni International, the Steinbeck Center, and the Norman Mailer Writers Colony. Born in South Korea, she has lived most of her life in the United States. Please welcome Alex and R.O. Thanks so much for coming.
Hi, hello. I'm so glad and excited to be here. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the Asian American Writers Workshop for hosting tonight's event and for the vital work you do. I've said this, but I've crushed on this space for like years. I've stalked events on Facebook Live, and it means so much to be here. And it's very meaningful for me to be here with Alexander Chee, who I first met 9 years ago at a writers' conference in Vermont. I'd read his book, Edinburgh, before then, and I remember just how much it meant to me to read a Korean-American writer. I'm Korean, and I really hadn't encountered any Korean-American writing until after college. Alex was one of the very first, and coming across his incredible, beautiful work was revelatory for me. And then I just met him by a magical fire, and he turned out to be an amazing human being on top of it, and it was glorious. So I'm going to read from The Incendiaries. It's my first novel, and thank you. It's about, well, you heard Sophia's description, but I'll repeat. It's a bit of it. It's about a Korean-American woman, Phoebe Lin, who's pulled into a radical group that turns out to be a cult with enigmatic ties to North Korea. The cult eventually bombs 5 U.S. healthcare clinics, abortion clinics, in the name of faith. When several bystanders die, she disappears. So I've been working on this book for 10 years, and so I've had a lot of chances. I've had to have a lot of chances in which I go to parties, dinner parties, Thanksgivings, in which people ask what I do, and I'd say, I write, I'm a writer, I'm working on a novel. And then they'd, of course, ask, what's it about? And so I would tell them pretty much exactly what I've just told you now. And by far the most common follow-up question has been, is your novel autobiographical? Which I never really knew how to answer that, because I think they were all asking, are you a domestic terrorist? Are you have you been in a violent extremist cult? I'm just not sure. A friend actually said, what he advised, you should say every time, I'm actually not at liberty to talk about that, but I've never tried that. We'll see. So short answer, no, I haven't blown up any buildings. But there is a longer possible answer about what obsessions and losses led to the book. So I thought I'd just touch briefly on those before reading a little from it. The novel does draw on my own background as a formerly zealous evangelical Christian until I was 17 and stopped believing. My life plan for a while was to become a preacher or missionary or maybe a religious recluse. I've long since left that faith behind, but I often still find the loss to be as fresh as though it happened maybe a few days ago. I know a lot of people, including me, very much including me, are justifiably sick of being asked to empathize with the ideologues who want us dead, our rights taken, our bodies claimed. But some anti-choice dogmatists truly do believe they're doing good, some terrorists even. Agnostic though I now am, actively progressive as I strive to be, I can't entirely forget the God-crazed girl I once was, the fanatic who believed that life starts at conception, who believing this could even have prioritized the rights of unborn fetuses over those of living women. And so in the Incendiaries, I was drawn to bridging imaginative chasms between rational and fanatic worldviews. I can't understand them, is what people often say about faith-motivated terrorists, and I hope to give some insight into how people can bring themselves to commit violent acts in the name of God, which in some cases is in the name of good. In addition, I have distant family members I've never met who live or lived, for all I know, in North Korea, and I'll probably never meet. And for a while, to try to fill that hole in knowledge, that longing, I kept reading accounts of North Korea. But of course, what little information makes it out is so incomplete, so fractured. And eventually, I became interested in exploring that gap itself. But in writing about North Korea, I really didn't want to make any claims about a place I've never been able to visit, and that so few people ever see. It's like very different than writing about, for instance, like Vancouver, right? Like you can go to Vancouver, you can go to Google Images, you can look up pictures of Vancouver. I felt a different kind of responsibility in trying to write fictionally about a place where that's not possible. And so, even as I gave a North Korean pass to the novel's cult leader, John Leal, I hoped to explore some of the vast gaps in knowledge about the country. I wanted to dwell imaginatively in that space itself, in that place of unknowing. So the sections I'll read are told from John Leal's point of view, and they span about 2 years of his life. In the book, they're fragmented throughout in very short chapters, but here I've just pulled some of them together. 1. Once John Leal left Knoxhurst, halfway through his last term of college, he drifted until he ended up in Yenji, China. In this city, adjacent to North Korea, he began working with an activist group that smuggled Korean refugees toward asylum in Seoul. He'd found his life's work, he thought. Instead, he was kidnapped by North Korean agents, spirited across the border, and thrown into a prison camp outside of Pyongyang. In the stories he later told the group, he said the gulag brutalities were bad enough, but at least they'd been expected. What astonished him was the allegiance his fellow inmates showed toward the lunatic despot whose policies had installed them in their cells. They'd been jailed because, they'd splashed a drop of tea on his newsprint portrait. A neighbor claimed to have overheard them whistling a South Korean pop song. Punished for absurdities, they still maintained that the beloved sovereign, a divine being, couldn't be to blame. At first, he assumed this was lip service, the prisoners afraid to say otherwise. But then he thought of the refugees he'd met in Yenji, how they talked of loving the God they'd fled. They attributed the regime's troubles to anyone but the sole person in charge. A month into John Leal's time in the Gulag, prison guards held an optional foot race, the prize a framed icon of the despot. In the confusion, those who fell were trampled. One child died of a broken spine. Through howls of pain, he shouted hosannas for his Lord. They weren't lying, the poor fools. They believed in the man as one might believe in Jesus Christ. Some people needed leading. In or out of the gulag, they craved faith. But think if the tyrant had been as upright as his disciples trusted him to be. The heights he'd have achieved if he loved them. If, John Leal thought, until his idea began. 2. 3 months into his captivity, John Leal was shoved in the back of a truck, driven from the gulag to the frozen riverbank and told to cross to China. He hesitated. A guard raised his gun, hit him with its butt. Bleeding from his temple, John Leal started walking. It was early March. Thin lines fissured the river's ice. Each spring, the thawed waters were said to clog with all those shot while trying to escape, the bodies preserved like fish where they'd been killed. Behind him, a guard laughed. If they didn't shoot him, they'd watch him plunge through ice and drown. He tried the next step. Spindrift lifted, fell. Inhale, exhale. His nerves stretched, a net to span the width of ice dividing him from the rest of his life. Filaments glittered, straining with his weight. China stood prismatic on the opposite side. He let out a long breath. His soul was blowing loose, but he inhaled. He pulled it back in. There was no being afraid. He walked on water with each step. The ice cracked. He held still. Try to live. Take a step again. 3. The fall, he returned to Knoxhurst. John Leal established a habit of paying morning visits to the graves on Hillcock Street. The churchyard gates opened at dawn. He went in to keep his vigil. Tall lindels stood bare, stripped by the cold, but still they raised their limbs in hallelujah. He walked about. He examined memorial inscriptions, the etched, once-loved names fading. Frost burned his feet. Winter softened into spring, and mossed obelisks pointed on high. In the estival heat, he set his back against the cold stone of a tomb. He plucked a honeysuckle stalk sprouting from what had once been men. He sipped its bit of juice. In time, lying in the dirt, he too might nourish future pilgrims. If he had one petition for himself, it was this, that he be made useful. But he was learning to be patient. His plan stood intelligible to him, lucid as a vision. If asked, before the Gulag, how a revelation might look, a heraldic blaze of light would have come to mind, the flap and gust of gale-force wind, his own dazzled, indisputable rip in the fabric of the usual. Instead, he had this, a plan, his chance. He lifted his face. Through linden branches, blue lozenges flashed like prizes he could reach up to have. His personal ambitions, though, no longer signified. He was thinking of mankind. In the months to come, when his group asked him about his first revelation, he had explained it had arrived at the shock of recognition. Yes, he thought, this was it. He'd been waiting. In fact, he said to his group, I felt like this when I first heard of you. 4. Knoxhurst, though, his group said. Of all the places he could have gone after Yenji, why had he returned here to his old college town? But John Leal saw no need to indulge such questions. He'd had his troubles, it was true. The night he first left Knoxhurst, he'd imagined he'd never return. I've since learned, he might have said, that nothing energizes like humiliation. It had rained his first day out of the Gulag, the lines slanting like marionette strings. In each breath he inhaled, he'd heard the call of the dying Christ. But none of this merited saying. It would be weak to tell too much, to explain. It could mislead. The Lord eludes the why. To insist is also a slight. Give me, we plead, testing him. In pursuit, we misprize. Lord, increase my bewilderment, they do well to ask. Instead, he told them he had been called back to Knoxhurst, God wanting him here. Just as he wants all of you, he said, looking in turn at his disciples' upturned faces. 5. He loved to think of heaven, he said. Think of the psalmist's plea, his love song. Whither shall I escape from thy spirit, he'd ask, knowing there's no escaping him. While they lived on earth, they might still hide beneath the flesh. But dying, they'd be given up naked to the light. That's all death is, he said. It's an unveiling. In time, they'd show like flares. 6. If he could, he'd admit that at times it wasn't simple. They'd pledged to fight in the service of the living God, and he'd learned to accept that faith is not a gift. It is not the object you receive intact at once by putting out a hand. Though long streamers of sunlight might fawn at his feet, faith came as the hard-won reward. Battle spoils he wrested from the heaped debris. The wars to come would be a divine healing, in which the pure would not be killed. Thank you.
got this fan specifically for this event. Hopefully it's not creating any problems with the camera. Is this on? Yeah. There we go. So it's not autobiographical.
Hard to believe, I know, but yeah.
I wondered, of the three characters, Will, John, and Phoebe, whose names head up all the chapters, which of them came to you first? Or did they come together?
I think pretty much from the start, I knew that the three would be involved in some way, but they did evolve dramatically. I spent the first 2 years reworking the first 20 pages of this novel over and over and over again, revising over and over and over again. I just had this idea, and this is like more proof to me of how powerful language is and how fucking dangerous language can be, and how dangerous metaphors can be. I just thought I needed a really solid foundation. So I was like, I need a solid foundation, so I need a perfect first chapter, and that perfect first chapter will then make it so I can move on. So I reworked these first 20 pages over and over. But the thing is, what I realized at the end of those 2 years is that you can't build a foundation if you don't know what the house will look like. And so it was like, am I building an opera house? Am I building a skyscraper? Am I building a bungalow by the beach? Who knows? I didn't know. So I threw those 20 pages away, and I restarted. And at that point, the book had more or less been about a woman, or at least for those 20 pages, because I didn't know what was coming after that. For 20 pages, the book had been about a woman, rather melancholic woman, who sort of wanders around by herself, meditating on the nature of an absent God. And that was as fun to read as that sounds, pretty much, about as appealing. I love meditative wandering around books. Like, I love me some Sebald. Like, Sebald is my jam. I love he's sitting right there, but I always cite him. Like, I love Teju Cole. You know, like, these are these are writers I've read over and over and over again. But I think for me it turned out this was not at least the book I was going to write. For me, the book started taking on more life once I started externalizing some of my obsessions with faith and with just differences in faith. And John Leal and Will had sort of been there. Will had been there as someone who loves Phoebe. John Leal had been there as some sort of problematic religious figure, but I wasn't quite sure what his role was.
And so Phoebe was last, in a sense? First and last both?
Phoebe was first, and then she, at that point, she was the only narrator of the book. And because at this point the book is narrated by these three different people. It's kind of narrated. I do some things with point of view, but it sort of switches between these three people.
There's a way in which the novel is also about this desire to give yourself over to something, and in the process be lost and also found simultaneously. And I think that's something that we see, like in Phoebe's chapters, where she's trying so hard with music, for example. And I was thinking about the attempt to be a virtuoso and the attempt to be, I don't know, no one ever, I think, imagines they're going to try to be a fanatic, right? They imagine that they will be simply the best believer, right? But there's something to that, right? Did you find that matched up also as you in the writing, or where does Phoebe's obsession with music come from for you, do you think? In that?
That's such an interesting question. Phoebe is very ambitious. In different ways, all three of the characters are very ambitious. So for those of you who haven't read the book, Phoebe wanted to be a piano prodigy. There were signs that indicated she could perhaps be a piano prodigy, but that doesn't quite work out the way she wants it to work out. And that's one of the that's one of the big life changes for her before she goes off to school, before she goes off to college, where she meets Will and John Leal. And I think I was and am very interested in what happens to ambition like that, if and when it loses its initial goal, at least. What do you do with that? Because I don't think that kind of drive, I don't think that kind of desire just disappears. Yeah.
There's a way in which we haven't really seen this much of the kind of Korean American evangelical experience in fiction, I think. And I wondered, beyond whatever it is that you experienced yourself, what you drew on for creating Phoebe's experience in particular.
So I grew up in a small town in Southern California in which that was predominantly Asian and predominantly Korean American on top of that. And so almost all the Korean Americans I knew were like fervently religious. We're just like super religious. Our fun Friday nights were going to youth group rallies. And the thing about youth group rallies at that level of fervor is that they are actually really fun. Like, you're singing, you're dancing, you're like falling to the ground, you're talking in tongues. Like, you get like such access to ecstasy in a way that, especially as like a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, just like, holy shit, you know? Like, it can feel really amazing. And so in that way, I was drawing a lot on my own experiences of that kind of Christianity, of that sort of all-encompassing, really exciting religion. I also did, in the early stages of working on this book, I visited a few times a church in Berkeley that had been accused of being a cult by a lot of people. It was still going on as a church. It had sort of moved past that. But like you look it up, and like in its Yelp reviews, people are like, "But it's a cult." And then other people are saying, "No, it's great. You know, we love it here." And so, but that did in some ways remind me of some of my own experiences. I at some point I was involved in a youth group that was so absorbing that all our parents were worried that it might be a cult, and it really wasn't. I think but it was just like we just wanted to spend all our time there, and yeah.
I'm curious in particular about those. I mean, that's interesting. Is it? Well, my interest in it is partly like, I think the Korean American evangelical experience is different from the evangelical experience, Christian in America in general, in the sense that it seems to be more about, rather than outward reaching, it functions as a kind of a shield from the country around it. I don't know, is that in this book?
I wonder if that's such a good question. I haven't thought too much about that. It is true that a lot of the Korean American Christians I knew growing up, they're still in the same church. They married within the church. Their friends are within the church, and you can see them just like they are very tightly. And I think it makes a lot more sense in a way with our first generation parents, in that like you come to this country, you don't know anyone, but there are all these Koreans. They're like, come to church and we'll love you, and it's just like, hey, great, you know, like new friends, new people to like help me make a life here. It does make a little less sense at the second generational level. I wonder how much that has to do with. The Christian. Well, I did at some point read quite a bit of, and then I tried to forget it all. Whenever I do a lot of nonfiction research into something, I try to forget it all as much as possible so that I can like make it my own. But I did read quite a bit about the history of Christianity in Korea. And one line that stayed with me is that Koreans are just bent on being the best. And so we make like extremely fervent Christians. We like, you know, like
Nobody plans to be a fanatic.
At least like in North Korea, you know, like we like really kept the communism thing going. Like it's just like Koreans like to be the best, and so maybe that's part of because there was certainly at least in faith as I experienced it, especially at that extremely fervent level, there was a lot of like, well, I want to be the best possible Christian. Like I want to be whatever that means. And so it's just like you're like praying all the time, or like you're like if you're trying to be like the most evangelical, you're like the one walking around with like Bible quotes written on the back of your, like all over you, like you're like a walking slogan was like an actual thing. Like people like would their textbooks, they would cover them in paper and put Bible quotes on the back. And by people, I mean me also. Like I was also one of these people. And
So John then is so his experiences. Who did you create him out of? Was he like inspired by a specific person, or he just sort of came out of your own imaginings? What would you say?
John Leal, I did do a lot of research into cult leaders and into cults. For a while, I read every nonfiction cult book I could find. Once again, I tried to like throw it away after a little while. So I had that sort of back knowledge in my head, but in some ways, and I always sort of wonder if I should maybe not say this, but in some ways, he was the most fun to write. Because so much of his power depends on language, and like the language and the power of preachers often depends on language. And so I could sort of play in a realm of pure language, which is decidedly where I like to hang out anyway. And so,
Sort of the preacher you gave up on being, in a sense, you just kind of projected into John, maybe.
Maybe because I did know like very charismatic preachers and youth group leaders who you just love to listen to, you know, like they have a way with language. And insofar as I ever had it in me to be a preacher, I think what would have been most fun for me in that maybe would have been playing with language, fiddling around with words.
I really admired your ethical stance that you cited earlier on how you were going to imagine his experiences in North Korea, how you're going to imagine North Korea. You mentioned that, but I wondered if you could get into that just a little bit more in terms of like how you developed that particular approach.
Yeah.
And maybe why.
So, I think, let's see. I don't think I'm giving too much away. If the thing is, I like never care about plot spoilers. When I read, I find plot to be very stressful. I often like flip to the end. I'm like, well, what does happen to him? Like, does he marry her? Like, and then, like when I was watching Friday Night Lights, I like read all the Wikipedia entries, so I would be less stressed out about what exactly was going to happen to these people. But I understand that like most people get like deeply pissed off about plot spoilers. So So I don't think I'm giving too much away if I say that there are a lot of ways in which John Leal's stories are not dependable, and the book points toward that over and over and over again. And so I wanted the book to make clear that there's no reason anyone reading this should walk away from this thinking like, okay, cool, you know, like I definitely know how North Korea works now. Like I know how gulags work now, you know. And I've been running into this just a little bit already. When like somebody asked like in an interview, they asked like my opinion of the Singapore situation with 45 and North Korea. And they wanted to know like what I thought of it, like where I thought it was going, and I was just like, seriously, dude, like I'm not your person. Like I'm a fiction writer. I've read about North Korea, and like I read like some of the like the articles in the Times about the situation. I got sad, I got mad. That's all I have for you. Like please don't ask me to be a pundit on this matter. And so, yeah, I think I love what Cortazar says. He says something about how he's on the side of the questions, and I think that's very much where I am as a fiction writer, and maybe even in life.
That's beautiful. I suppose we should turn our attention finally to Will a little bit, at least a little, who in some ways is most devoted to Phoebe, right? But has his own very important role. And I think what's interesting to me about the movement between the three characters in the novel is the way in which we get information about the others through those sections. quite regularly, and how that builds up and builds up a kind of momentum. Did you ever imagine just not having Will in it, or was his perspective always significant?
That's such an interesting question. You're asking so many questions other people haven't asked, which I love. Will, for me, okay, so for the first 2 years, the book was told entirely from Phoebe's point of view, and for a little while after that, I still thought maybe the book would be told entirely from Phoebe's point of view. The Phoebe is going through just like a ton of shit. There's a whole situation with her piano. There's a situation with her mother that's very, very, very painful to her. And then, she goes to school, and then she starts falling into a cult. I'm giving nothing away. Again, all of this is in like the first 2 pages. She's probably involved in blowing up buildings. So these are drastic life experiences, right? And so for me, it felt claustrophobic to stay in her point of view. It was too many extremes. I felt like hemmed in by the strength of her emotions, by the strength of her sorrow, by the strength of her joy. And so it gave me space, just a little bit of space, to tell so much of the story from the point of view of someone who loves her, but is at a slight remove, who's just like a little bit away from who's a little bit out of the immediate action of the book. And I thought a lot about, I know this is like the least original thing, but like I love The Great Gatsby. I reread it all the time, and I thought a lot about what the book gains from having Nick Carraway tell the story, rather than Jay Gatsby or Daisy Buchanan or Tom Buchanan or anyone else almost in that story. And yeah, so Will did become very again, this book took 10 years. For 4 years, I think, the book was told entirely from Will's point of view. And then I showed it to my agent, and who I love and trust, and she just was like, yeah, okay, yeah, but she was like, I just wonder, I just don't have that strong of can we get more of Phoebe in here? And I was like, well, I spent 2 years on her point of view, so I actually know a lot about Phoebe that maybe didn't make its way in. And that was when Phoebe's and John Leal's sections just started getting added back in, because of how little Will is involved in some of the most like, I guess, like noticeable action.
That is fascinating. That you spent all that time working so close to her, and then pulled all the way back to the other side before creating this sort of final version. And the relationship to Gatsby is really fascinating too, I think, because I've been trying to think of like how we define what the great American novel is, and I think it's stories about fraud. And about frauds in particular, in which case I think your novel at least is in the category. Wow. All right. So I'm sure people here have some questions, so I thought we would open it up a little bit to the audience. Please raise your hand. A mic will be brought to you so that we can hear your question, since it's being recorded.
Hello. Sorry. I have a cold, but so if you're comfortable sharing, what was like that moment when you were 17 that led you to sort of like change your beliefs? And also sort of related, is like Will the character that most stems from like your own experience in that process?
Could you repeat the last part of the question? Sorry.
Is Will the character that maybe most like autobiographically represents you?
Okay, let's see. So I never had like a single defining moment when I really lost the faith. It was just an accumulation of questions that I couldn't answer. An accumulation of, well, one thing that I think did directly lead to my losing the faith is I was always a reader, as I'm sure a lot of the people in this room were and are. And I read so many books, and I was always reading these books from the points of view of people who did not share my exact set of beliefs. And so it became increasingly difficult to believe that everyone who did not believe what I did was going to be condemned to hell. And I became very tangled up in just like in just like very specific theological questions. Like, and I was like, what about the people who lived before Jesus Christ came to earth? Or they like lived in some other corner of the earth? Like, how come they have to go to hell? And then there were so many different answers, and people are like, well, maybe they don't go to hell, maybe they go somewhere else. Like, and I was just like, this is fucked up, man. Like, this does not feel like a satisfying answer. So I was concerned about that. I was very. I mean, this is also very common among people who experience apostasy. I was very troubled by the question of evil, and of how an omniscient, omnipotent, always good being allows so very much evil and suffering in the world, which of course like Dostoevsky explores like so powerfully, and reading Dostoevsky on this point was also illuminating to me. I don't know that I'd say Will is the most autobiographical character, but his experiences of losing faith, while not totally factual, were I very much wanted to I wanted that to reflect. I wanted to be true to my own experience of losing faith in some way or another, and by that I mean like getting at the emotional truth of it, the core of it, even if the actual facts didn't necessarily line up.
Hey, so you keep saying the novel took you 10 years, which like I love to hear because probably will take me at least that. And I think that good books take a long time, but they also have their own. I mean, one thing is that I think we expect people to write books really quickly, and you didn't. It sounded like you were really deliberate. But did you ever have moments where you lost the faith, or how did you stay connected to your book, and what was your experience of your relationship to the book as you evolved with it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Oh my gosh, I lost my faith in the book like every other day. Or I don't know, maybe every day, like every 20 minutes. I don't know. Like so much of there were so many times when it just became a running joke in my apartment because I would just like I would have been working and I'd like emerge slumping like from my desk, and I would just like talk to my husband, and he'd just be like, "What's wrong?" And I'd be like, "It's just like I don't think I'm meant to do this. Maybe I should become a dermatologist. It's not too late." Like I was like, I'm super into skincare. Like that seems like a much more pleasant life, perhaps, like with far fewer ups and downs. And he'd just be like, yeah, whatever. Like, and then he did like the joke was like JKW, like just keep writing, because if I kept writing, then I would find my way back to it. And I actually found artist residencies to be so helpful in this respect, because at residencies I could physically see how cyclical it was, and how fast I would go from believing that like, yes, like this is definitely gonna work, like I was meant to be a writer, to like, oh my God, what am I doing? Life is terrible. I need to do something else. But those would like zigzag so fast I could see it. The other thing for me is like as is probably clear by now, I really love sentences. I love a good sentence. I love prose. I love syllables. I have increasingly strong feelings about individual letters of the alphabet, which is getting increasingly problematic, because I have stronger and stronger feelings about how a sentence should look on the page based on how the letters look. So all of that means that if I'm just hanging out in the words, and I'm just hanging out in the syllables, and I'm just trying to make them work, and deep in that part of the writing, then there's no space for me to worry about what I'm doing with my life, and like who am I, and why is it that like my friends are like fucking like neurosurgeons saving lives while like I'm just rewriting the same sentence all day long. And so yeah, the less time I could spend in that ego-free space where I'm just writing, and where like where it's like the state of grace. It's like the best joy I know at this point. Where if I'm there, then I can keep working. I don't even need to worry if I have faith in myself, because I'm just doing it. Granted, I don't know how to get there, and the only way I know of getting there is by just continuing to write.
Hi, thank you for being here. I loved the book. I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this question without giving away any spoilers, but I was wondering about the choice to create Will to be an imperfect character, especially in his relationship to Phoebe, and there's a moment in particular towards the end of the book when something happens, and when I'm like, oh, up until this point I was rooting for you, and you were the good guy, and you were looking out for whatever, and then there are certain choices that he makes where he's not perfect and he's not a good guy, and I think you developed him and his relationship with Phoebe well in terms of showing how much he cares about her, but also showing that he's definitely not perfect, and definitely not very moral. So I was curious why you decided to include that, and overall your thoughts about Phoebe and Will's relationship.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So first I'll say that I don't decide very much when I'm writing. I sort of follow the logic of the sentences I follow, but I also follow the characters, and I'm sort of asking them to show me who they are. They go into different situations, we do things. In all likelihood, I then delete the scene, and I do that 99 more times. And then at some point comes a scene where it feels right, where they're behaving the way they seem to be the truest versions of themselves. And so, so I was dismayed when Will revealed himself when Will does something. There's a key action that he takes. I was completely dismayed. I actually tried really hard to not write that scene because I was just like, man, seriously? Like I was upset. But there's something that a mentor of mine, who I met in grad school, Michael Cunningham, who's wonderful, he says often, he said, at least when I was in school, he said that we must love our characters as God does and not more, which I think about a lot. And so oh my gosh. Hello? So I believe very much in letting the characters in following the characters versus dictating to them who I would like them to be or who I think they are even. Yeah.
Where do you write and where do you read?
Where do I write? Where do I read? I like to write in my dining room, where I have a desk set up. I have no pictures up on my walls. I have nothing up on the walls at all. I have beige walls in my entire apartment. And that's true of this space where I work too. And I find that that's helpful because then I have nothing to look at except what's going on inside my head. If I'm traveling or whatever, I'm just like in an Airbnb, or if I'm in a hotel, if there's a picture in front of me, I have to move the desk. If there's a window, that's hell. Like I have to do something about the window because life is so interesting outside. I have to take away all the interesting things. And yes, as for where I read, I'll read anywhere, but I really love, one thing I really miss though is reading on the subway in New York. Like I feel as though I used to get so much reading done on the subway in New York, and somehow it's different in San Francisco. I love San Francisco, it's not the same. But I actually really love reading in bed. Like it feels so luxurious, right? Like you're just like in there reading. It feels like being a kid again. I have blackout curtains, and so I have like no sense of time passing by and large. There's very little visual stimulation in my apartment, basically. I just published, this is like, I've been getting like the most heated mentions in my life. I published a piece in LitHub about how I shelve my books spine in. And like, and I have all these reasons, and like I explain myself, but even so, my mentions right now are like, I've just been like blocking people right and left. Like they're like making assumptions about like my moral character, like about, I don't know, anyway.
I mean, it makes perfect sense to me now that you've explained all this.
Hi. I have two questions. This is your debut novel, but is it your only novel, or have you written others? And if you have, was this like the third one or the fourth one? And the other one is, did you have an outline for this book? Did you work off an outline, or did it just come out?
So this is my first novel. I haven't written any other novels. Thank God, or I think that would take another 10 years, right? But I think because I worked on it so much, it changed so much. Like there was a whole section that I deleted that I worked on for probably like months. That was told entirely from the point of view of like Phoebe's father in 1970s Korea. that's just gone. Like, goodbye. That was 100 pages, you know? So this has been, I'm just like not an efficient writer.
You don't have any record of it at all?
Oh, I have it.
Okay.
Somewhere like deep in the deep in the archives. I just have a whole folder called like scraps or something. But as for whether I have it in outline, I don't tend to, well, I think like after draft like 11 or 14 or who the hell knows, I have no idea how many drafts I went through. I did write like a 1-page outline just to see what the story looked like. And I was like, okay, cool. And then I think I never looked at that again. I don't tend to know where I'm going at all when I start. And I think that's, I find that on the one hand very frustrating and very inefficient. But on the other hand, I think it's part of what makes fiction writing so fascinating for me. I think if I knew ahead of time everything that was going to happen, then I don't think I would be doing this. Granted, other people obviously like make beautiful outlines and like that's just how I work. But
kind of going off of the lack of outline and what it sounds like your process is there a specific image or a scene or something that was sort of your first flash of the world of this book and what it was going to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So after those first 2 lost, terrible years, the first 2 pages of the novel, which take place on a rooftop, and you see a building explode, and they're watching it. That came relatively quickly to me soon after I threw away those first 20 pages that I'd been working on. And I think that was when I think I just, and those pages stayed more close to themselves than almost anything I've ever written in my entire life. Like Alex heard a version of this 9 years ago at this writers' conference.
It was great.
Those pages stayed, and yeah.
And where are they now?
They're still in the first 2 pages. So they just
It's still those same first 2 pages.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. Those stayed, and like the prose has stayed more similar to what it was then too, which also almost never happened. So I almost wonder if those like 2 years of working those 20 pages over and over again was just like slowly leading me to that image and that moment, or maybe that's just what I'm going to tell myself, so I feel better about my choices.
Was the reading happened at this reading series that, do they still do it at Breadloaf? The Dark Tower? It was called The Dark Tower, which we always just sort of laughed when we went in, because it was the Writers of Color reading series. They're like, and everybody got to read like about 2 pages, because there were so many. But it was always, I don't know, I always loved it. I'm so happy. Anyway. More questions? Well, yeah, maybe this is the last one. Yeah.
Hi. So there's definitely an or a white American perception of Asian Americans and even Asians at large as a very passive, even impotent group of people. And you wrote a novel about Asian Americans who do these violent things and act forcefully, fueled by passion. And I wonder if that was intentionally subversive of those stereotypes, or at the very least pleasurably subversive, especially as a Korean American woman.
Yeah, let's see. I think on the one hand, I have a lot of beliefs and anger about what it is to be an Asian American woman in America. On the other hand, when I go into writing my fiction, I never go into it with sort of intentions like that. Like what intentions of subverting stereotypes. I don't. It's so much for me just to, like, I just want to stick with the syllables. Is really where I find the truest guide. That said, let's see. I thought that, and I think I believe this in general, at least for my own writing. I hate making generalizations. I'm the worst at it. At least for my own writing, I find that if I'm very specific and if I try to remain as true to my experience of the world as a person, but also as a Korean American woman, then that in and of itself is perhaps a political statement.
There you go. Thank you so much to the Asian American Writers Workshop, all of our hosts and volunteers and interns and everyone in the community in general. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you for coming here for your book and bringing it to us.
Thank you.
Anyway.